In the sweltering heat of the Thai Phuket low season, the months of May, June, July, and August, I wanted to touch on some of our culture's taboos and bring some attention and some light, not so much on the taboos, but on the culture which pockets taboos. So this is going to be a little bit of a play, a very uncomfortable play for many Westerners, and I would suspect particularly women. But it is in the diving into and exploration of taboos that silence and shame is transformed into scientific knowledge that empowers you, me, etc., to make more conscious choices, which, to the degree that we are healthy, are choices that lead to human well-being. To the degree that we are unhealthy, we will use our power, our influence, more information, more money to increase the harm that we cause as we externalize our wounds. However, I think it's useful to start with the foundation that human beings are predisposed to goodness, that they are predisposed to growth and evolution, and that it is only in situations where, in order to meet needs, Maslow talks about the hierarchy of needs, survival, security, belonging, as the first three needs in order. And he puts sex in the first survival needs, the physical needs, survival, security, and love and belonging, moving to self-esteem and self-actualization, self-transcendence. When there is an unhealthy environment, the path to meeting one's needs is an unhealthy path. For example, in situations where people are enslaved, the path to meeting one's need to self-actualize could include the necessity of killing the owner that is enslaving you. It is not nature, it is not predisposed that we kill to meet our needs, but in unhealthy environments, it pits the goodness of each individual on their path to meeting their needs against the people who are standing squarely in the way of those needs. It's also, I think, important in a larger context to be aware of the abundance of energy, and of the abundance of resources in our environment, in our world, in our culture. There is more than enough time, more than enough money, more than enough technology, more than enough land, more than enough solar power, more than enough wind power, more than enough nuclear power, more than enough wave energy, more than enough sunlight. There is more than enough oxygen. There is more than enough water. There is an abundance of resources to facilitate every single human being on the planet on a journey of climbing Maslow's hierarchy of needs, both in paradigms of independence, in paradigms of dependence, and in paradigms of interdependence. That there is more than enough resources and energy to meet all of our survival needs, all of our security needs, all of our love and belonging needs. The more people there are, the more opportunities there are for love and belonging. All of our self-exploration needs. The more people there are, the more opportunities there are to explore and to grow, as well as all of our needs to transcend. For millions of years, nature has been providing natural entheogens, natural substances that help the conscious framework of the ego, a technology, if you will, created by nature for a certain kind of environment, to transcend itself and reestablish a consciousness, an awareness of how we fit into an ecological environment. Now, knowing that there is enough, that there is more than enough, that there always has been enough and always will be enough, time, energy, resources, etc., for every single person on the planet to be on a steady, stable, secure path on Maslow, to meet what Maslow has identified as every single human being's needs. The technology of culture, the technology of thought that is the foundation of Western culture, must be evaluated based on its facility to do just that, based on its facility to meet the physical, health, sexual, and logistical needs of its people, based on its ability to create security for its people, certainty of survival, based on its ability to create environments in which people feel loved and belong, and based on the consciousness and intelligence with which such institutions as education facilitates self-awareness, self-esteem, self-actualization, and in time, self-transcendence, courtesy of the endogenous DMT in our own bodies. It's a very interesting scenario culturally when a Schedule I drug, DMT, is found within every single human brain. And when this DMT is the molecule responsible in certain induced states of ritual, in near-death experience, sometimes in traumatic experience, for experiences of dissolving into a larger field and being aware of the interconnectedness of things that our culture has masked and obfuscated with the intensity of its dogmas, with the intensity of its sensory direction, with the intensity of its traumatic protocols that has pushed away. So into this context comes these very interesting phenomena of taboos. Taboos are things that a culture disowns, and then disowns that it disowns. So it's a two-step dissociation. So the first thing about a taboo is it's not welcome. That's the first step. But the second step is that it cannot be talked about, that it's not welcome. A taboo is not something that is articulately communicated. For example, incest or whatever it is not explained to a culture in rational terms, although it takes place in a surprisingly large percentage of the culture, it is not taking place within a rational dialogue of the impacts physiologically, psychologically, genetically, with an interest in studying the phenomena, studying the fathers and mothers that feel compelled to have sex with their children, and studying the results both of the incest, but also the results of the shame-based taboo protocol within a culture that is in denial of the extent of what is considered within the culture sexual abuse. And so a taboo is something that is first disowned, and then that is disowned that it is disowned, which in the case of incest survivors means that they are alone, and alone in their aloneness, because in order to belong, in order to be a part and to feel part, to meet that third need in Maslow's hierarchy of love and belonging, the relationships within which one wants to experience belonging must embrace, must understand, must see the more significant experiences that form a person's identity, a person's sense of self-experience. And so within that context, those significant relationships must include an awareness of incest, an awareness of its impact, and even more important, an awareness of the daily impact of living in a cult. Because the difference between a philosophy such as science and a cult is the irrational application of dogma. So we like to think of ourselves moving towards science, and yet there are many pockets within science that are far more political than they are scientific. There are many pockets within culture that are far more cult and dogma based and instinctual based than they are based on psychology, based on data, based on science. And incest is one of those areas. Incest is an area that, because it is shamed into taboo, the message of the older person in the incest is that your physical limitations, your emotions, your psychological well-being does not matter to me. Now, this is a phenomenally dehumanizing message, and it goes right to the heart of an ego attack, because the ego survives with the sense that this is me and I matter. I am valuable. My thoughts, my feelings, my body matters. And because it matters, it will be respected and protected. But it goes much deeper than that when it is the protector, the parent, that violates the boundary. When the protector, with a vastly different body ratio to the abuse survivor, uses overwhelming psychological and physical influence in a context of dependency to violate rather than protect. And violate much more than the fragile vagina or penis of the child, but violate the ability of that child to integrate in a cult that is too immature, that is too chauvinistic, that is too emotionally illiterate to understand the experience of the abuse survivor, to thus have the capacity to love the incest survivor. And the safety that in that tender and vulnerable terrain of the psyche, in which the innocence is bubbling up, that in that vulnerable and sensitive terrain in the psyche, that is in grief, in shock, and dissociation due to the violation, that when let into that domain, the circle around the incest survivor will have the necessary level of tenderness, empathy, care, vulnerability, to not re-shame the abuse survivor, because to re-shame is to overload the system, is to engage in a way that is beyond the technical capacity, emotionally, mentally, or physically, ability of the incest survivor. To do that, to ask an incest survivor to speak about things that are overwhelming to speak about, to show a level of disowning a lack of empathy that one cannot deal with, is shaming in a way. It is shaming in a way that sends the message again to the incest survivor: I do not see you. You are not valuable enough for me to understand, to take the time to learn to understand, and through that understanding come to respect who you are. In the context in which one's primary caregiver has initiated the first series of violation and the first series of messages that you are worthless and have no value. The second wave of message by the surrounding cult in a dogma of emotional illiteracy, a dogma that is so thick that despite the scientific data that is evident and common sense, that every single thought, that every single action that has ever been taken by a human being is motivated by an emotion, including sexual abuse, including suicide, including pathology and goal achievement and science, that every scientist who has ever got out of bed to go to the laboratory has done so on the foundation of mental emotional algorithms that trigger the chemicals in their body to get out of bed. And the universe of emotion is as sophisticated, is as nuanced, is as scientific as the universe of thought, as the universe of chemistry, as the universe of physics. We are looking at a disowned science in which a third of the felt experience of every single human being throughout history is systematically dishonored, is systematically and unscientifically negated from scientific study at every level of our education, such that you and I are more likely to understand algebra than we are likely to understand the components of hatred, or the components of rage, or the components of helplessness. You and I are more likely to understand the components of glass, the components of stainless steel, the components of a computer system, then we are likely to understand the components of our own emotions, the very alchemy, the very motivator of every single action in human history. And one must ask oneself, is it science or cult dogma that not a single American child will receive a single formal hour of emotional literacy about a single emotion? Far from it. Every American child will be exposed to shame, humiliation, violation of the feminine. We don't even know the difference, by the way. If you sit down 1,000 Americans randomly and ask them to break down the difference between masculine energy and feminine energy and why, there's no science there, because there's no training, there's no education. If you ask 1,000 Americans, if you ask yourself, what environmental conditions are necessary to produce hatred in a human being? Can you articulate them in the abstraction? Use that algebra. Can you create hate as a systemic probability? And simultaneously, can you transmute that hate into joy? Can you transform it? Do you know how to do that? And if you do not, in an environment that does induce an enormous amount of hatred and violence, the question is why? Is it based on relevancy? Is it based on science, that a third of our felt experience, including the felt experience of every single scientist who has ever created and generated anything, if we understand that every scientist is following Maslow's hierarchy of needs to become a scientist and pursuing those needs of significance and meaning and purpose and belonging, etc., in the dogmatic application of the scientific paradigm to do work that makes very little sense other than that this is a human being on a path of meeting their human needs using our culture's fixation with science as a way to build self-esteem, as a way of belonging, as a way of surviving and feeling secure in that survival. Why it is that the scientists who use emotions every day receive no formal education on the chemistry and makeup of their raw materials, but might be trained extensively on the use of measurements and test tubes, etc., to focus with those emotions on external materials. These are taboos, and they differentiate a healthy living culture from the dogma of a cult. A healthy living culture does not have taboos. It has a relationship of causes and effects and correlations that its people are informed about. And if you learn that the probability of your child being 20% more mentally incapacitated as a result of two family members marrying one another, that has to be taken into account on a scientific basis. As does, well, we're not going to have children. As does, what is the statistical impact of the amount of societal abuse targeted on low-income children in religious families that insist on having a child that is hated because it is a child of rape? What is the statistical impact on that? And is there an objective metric that correlates this not to instinct, not to dogma, but to data, and says that this is the optimum path based on the data, and this is the path that adds about 30% or 300% problems based on the data, and this is the path that seems to drive most people mad. You have a 90% chance of going insane if you participate in this, and here is why. Not because you are fundamentally bad, not because of your fundamental goodness or badness, but just when you mess with brain chemistry in this kind of an environment in this way, this thing tends to happen. When you mess with sexuality in this way, this tends to happen. The problem, that there is a conscious and scientific correlation between behavior and its impact based on the leading paradigm of our day, which is the scientific method. And are we willing to understand the raw materials of our cult? Are we willing to pay attention to the fact that a child who is sexually violated in our culture might have a 300% increase in shame, and a child that is taken away and blaring police cars from all that is familiar might have a 6,000% increase in trauma, or not? Are we willing to look deeply at our own coding and our own responsibility for impact in and outside of taboos? And it's in this context that I want to talk about a few very light versions of cults and taboos in our culture, lived through my eyes in my own life. Now, the first scene in this is I want you to, well, let me first introduce you a little bit to Thai culture. I came to Thailand because I was aware that my greatest happiness, my greatest joy, my greatest sense of life came from tenderness with children, came with a sense of wonder and play, comes with a sense of responsiveness and spaciousness around time, comes with smiling, comes with a sense that people are not afraid of me. And I began experiencing in American parks, where I had purchased a radio control car, I began experiencing that if I paid more than 10 seconds of attention to a young boy or a young girl, it seemed to terrify the parents. And the message that I received was that I was a pedophile, that I was a horrible person that needed to be protected against. And yet the reality is that the presence of those children in many cases, or at least the children I paid attention to, was far more interesting and alive than the presence of the adult. Now, in a Western culture, presence is not measured. There will be no Forbes Fortune 400 list of the most present people in America. Because, again, unscientifically, presence is off the chart. Presence is an innate human experience that you're having right now. You're having an experience of my presence. If you make me a video, I will have an experience of your presence. But there will be no single hour in middle school, kindergarten, or high school in which presence is understood, measured, communicated in any formal way. Again, the felt experience of human beings completely boycotted from an education system which is charged with bringing mastery and awareness to the human experience in a way that facilitates survival, security, love and belonging, self-esteem, self-actualization, self-transcendence, the core human needs, the microcosm of the development of the brain from the time in which we were alligators in a completely sociopathic state, the time when we were mammals to human animals, and now spiritual human beings and then spiritual beings. And that evolution in the brain, which follows from the sociopathic state of a crocodile all the way to the endogenous DMT state of transcendence and connection. Presence is a key variable in the human and in the spiritual regions of the brain, not so much the human, animal, and below. Presence. But it is, despite permeating every moment of every human interaction, completely invisible within the cult, other than that's a charismatic person from time to time, which is not taught. Well, why? How did they get that way? When is it positively used? When is charisma used to take people down into dark places? When is it, we don't study the most fundamental phenomena in our relationships, despite the fact that culture or cults are nothing but the largely unanimous consent to maintain what is often a very arbitrary status quo. We agree to reference how many bits of paper are in someone's bank account and create institutions to measure that and track that and make that and call ourselves a capitalistic culture and do this and do that and the other, and everyone agrees to do that, and so we are a cult based on money. But it's very arbitrary when we could be a cult based on emotions. We could measure emotions, respond to emotions, have institutions that create positive emotions, and be a much happier culture. Why? Is it scientific? Did science dictate that creating bits of paper was more fundamental to the perpetuation of the species than focusing on human emotions? Or has science negated its responsibility to measure human survival? Because you have to ask, if a culture is attuned emotionally to itself and is emotionally literate, does it have a higher chance of survival as a species than if the culture is unemotional, sociopathic, emotionally illiterate, emotionally abusive, shaming, violating, etc.? but has the technological capacity to hurt and kill each other. In other words, does the species perpetuate more if people are technologically advanced and emotionally illiterate, or if they are emotionally advanced and technologically illiterate? Well, in our current day, the science would suggest that our greatest threat to the species' survival is the correlation of unattuned, unsustainable capitalism, consumption, and warfare. That the combination of those three things, without emotional literacy and attunement, without the ability to get on with one's neighbor, let alone other countries and our environment, without the ability to respect and honor who we are, let alone honor other people and support their religion and various things. What is endangering the species? Is it emotional literacy? Emotional illiteracy, I'm using the term a little bit inaccurately, but emotional ignorance, or is it technological ignorance? Do we need bigger bombs or faster cars, or do we need to learn to attune to our environment, to develop an emotional relationship with our own selves, our own family, our own peoples, our own world, and our own planet? This is an emotional connection. In this area, we are much more like a cult than we are a culture. We are much more unscientific than we are scientific. Scientists who are not emotional and based on a cult look at what matters and are aware that science is in service of the perpetuation of the species, as opposed to that the species should die to perpetuate science. It's a little bit illogical. And so, how much of science is being used to understand the core software of our emotional selves? We get into trouble when we use half paradigms and half admixtures, etc. To be truly scientific is to treat the heart, the mind, and the body as an integrated circuit that needs integrated education for better results, based on the results. And since the well-being of individuals goes up when they are mentally, emotionally, and physically literate, when they are knowledgeable about how their heart works, their mind works, and their body works, and since the well-being and thus the sustainability of the species goes down, the more ignorance there is about any mixture of heart, mind, and body. And since they work as an integrated system, they deserve to be treated equally. Taboos are going in the opposite direction, in which something is not only disowned, which means it's not studied scientifically, but it is then disowned that it is disowned. As if you read Michael Pollan's new book, Changing Your Mind, or How to Change Your Mind, one of the more interesting things is the phenomena of the science of psychedelics being studied scientifically, then being subsumed in waves of politics and hysteria, and slowly re-emerging scientifically. But one can see again in that dynamic not a scientific relationship with science, but an irrational, the kind of response when a culture does not understand its own emotions, its own fears, and is thus run by them towards its own ruination, as opposed to embracing knowledge, embracing science, scientifically rather than dogmatically. I think I'll leave it at that in the abstract, just because I have some things to do. But thank you for your presence and your attention in this area.